History as it happens, May 4th, 2021. Recognizing genocide.
America is an idea, the most unique idea in history.
For the first time, an American president is recognizing the mass murder of Armenians by the Turkish government as genocide, a crime against humanity that Turkey denies to this day. So why are the mass graves of 1915 relevant in 2021? That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Each year I gather with Armenian Americans in Times Square to commemorate the annual anniversary of this atrocity. And every year my heart breaks for the victims of the genocide and their descendants. There are very few left, but some very elderly people are sitting in the audience each year, reminding us of how painful and how real that genocide was.
Here is a headline from the New York Times, October 1915. 800,000 Armenians counted destroyed. During the First World War, newspapers and diplomats in the United States and Europe documented the massacres and deportations that took place in what is now Turkey, what was then the Ottoman Empire, ruled by the Young Turks. As the journalist Robert Fisk put it, rarely have genocidal killings been given publicity on this scale. Yet no U.S. president until Joe Biden used the word genocide to describe what happened. In fact, U.S. leaders have performed verbal acrobatics to avoid the word, to avoid angering Turkey, their ally. Here is Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in 2007 under questioning from California Congressman Adam Schiff during a House hearing.
I think that these historical circumstances require a very detailed and sober look from historians. And what we've encouraged the Turks and the Armenians to do is to have joint historical commissions that can look at this, to have efforts to examine their past, and in examining their past, to get over their past. But I will tell you, Congressman, I don't think that it helps that process of reconciliation for the United States to enter this debate at that level. I just don't think.
Madam Secretary, your comments that you think that there should be some kind of debate or discussion about the genocide suggests that you have a question about whether genocide occurred.
In 2011, there's a new Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, but the same old answer.
I think it's fair to say that this has always been viewed, and I think properly so, as a matter of historical debate and conclusions rather than political.
A decade ago, when Mike Pence was a congressman, he did recognize the Armenian Genocide.
I believe a genocide was committed against the Armenian people in the early part of the last century, and it should never be forgotten.
Again, that was Congressman Pence. Vice President Pence made no such statements. And you may remember Barack Obama broke a campaign promise to recognize the genocide once he became president. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this chapter of history, it's certainly okay to ask if the events of 1915 met the definition of genocide. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. It's not necessary to want to kill or actually kill every last person from a certain group for it to be genocide. The word was coined by lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1944. The consensus among historians is Turkey committed genocide against the Armenians, and at least 30 countries have recognized it, although the United Nations hasn't. So why now? Why does 1915 matter all of a sudden in U.S. politics? Well, it's always mattered to Armenian Americans who have long called on the country to accurately describe what happened to their people a century ago. President Biden has said he wants to emphasize human rights in U.S. foreign policy. The relationship between the two countries has turned rather icy. Turkey's autocratic leader, Recep Erdogan, has moved closer to Russia. So let's go deeper on this now with Howard Eissenstat, Associate Professor of Middle East History at St. Lawrence University. His research focuses on nationalism and Islam in the 19th century Ottoman Empire, as well as the history of the Turkish Republic. Howard Eissenstat, welcome.
Hey, Martin, good to be with you.
So let's begin in 1915. What happened in the former Ottoman Empire?
I'm actually going to back up even further just to lay down some of the groundwork of what the Ottomans
Sure.
were thinking, which is that the Ottoman Empire had been under pressure and engaged in territorial loss for the preceding century. As it did so, there was a process of ethnic cleansing that was going on in lost territories, also in the expanding Russian Empire, that sometimes Ottoman troops were massacring Christians and sometimes Christian troops were massacring Muslims. The whole history leading up to 1915 was connected to this experience of ethnic cleansing and this increasing sense that conflicts were national, they were communitarian, and they were existential. And I think that that really shapes Ottoman thinking going into the war. They had been defeated in the Balkan Wars, and the leadership of the CUP, the leadership of the Committee for Union and Progress, the governing party, they were mostly people who had been born in territory that the Ottoman Empire had already lost. As they went into this war, they very much saw it as an existential war. And by that time, they had already perceived non-Muslims as a potential threat within the empire. And so in the prelude to war, in the months before the war, there had been agreements with Bulgaria, agreements with Greece to sort of transfer populations across the borders. The Ottomans were already thinking about this. They transferred large numbers of Greek Orthodox within the empire in the months leading up to the war. Initially, non-Muslims were recruited into the military. There were plenty of Armenian troops. As it became clear that the Ottomans were in for a nasty fight, as it became clear that they were not going to have an easy war, they began to look at the Armenians as enemy within. In 1915, they start arresting Armenian intellectuals, leadership, members of parliament in Istanbul. They start disarming Armenian troops, and they start a process of transfer within the empire, moving people from areas that they saw as higher risk to effectively the Syrian desert. And in that process, there were massacres and huge numbers of people killed. And it was clear, and it was the historical evidence makes it clear, that the goal was to destroy not every single Armenian, but to destroy the Armenians as a viable population within the empire.
Armenians were fighting for the Tsarist army for Russia, correct?
Some were, but some were fighting in the Ottoman army. I mean, to go to that question, were there Armenians who were fighting against the Ottomans? Yes, there were. And it wasn't fantastical for the Ottomans to perceive that population as potentially threatening. In the end, though, the Ottoman response was not to simply target those people who were fighting against them. It was to target the entire population.
So we're talking about deportations to the desert, massacres, mass graves. And this was the Sultan's government, or by this time were the Young Turks in charge?
So this is technically a constitutional monarchy, effectively a triumvirate, a dictatorship of a few within the Committee for Union and Progress. The Sultan is technically the head of the state, but the government is this group of sort of secular nationalists that go by the party name of the CUP, are often referred to as the Young Turks.
In Robert Fisk's The Great War for Civilization, he talks about 15th of September 1915. He says there's a carbon of this document that still exists. The Turkish Interior Minister cables an instruction to a prefect in Aleppo. You have already been informed that the government has decided to destroy completely all the indicated persons living in Turkey. Their existence must be terminated, however tragic the measures taken may be, and no regard must be paid to either age or sex or to any scruples of conscience. So documents such as this one support the argument that this was a genocide, yes?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a question that it was a coordinated effort. It's fair to note that the genocide was actually, in a sense, gendered. Men were particularly targeted for death. Women were often sold into household or sexual slavery. Children were forcibly taken from families. It's useful to think about not only the ways in which the genocide was similar to other genocides, but the way it's distinctive. And this was not a racial project, right? It was a project aimed at destroying Armenian identity, but it wasn't aimed necessarily at killing every last Armenian in the empire.
And the world knew about it while it was going on. Whatever controversy may exist today, there was little mystery as to what was happening in 1915, right?
The term genocide wasn't used, obviously, because the term wasn't coined until some decades later. But the idea of this broad-scale massacre was well publicized in the Western press. German staff officers knew about it. It wasn't a secret. But it was also, and I think it's worth considering, it was also being undertaken in the context of
the worst war ever. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think it's useful when we think of World War I, we in the West, we tend to think of the Western Front, which was a static front in which there were huge numbers of dead, but they were largely military dead. The war in the East was a war of movement. It was accompanied by mass starvation. It was accompanied by outbreaks of cholera and disease. And the death tolls were much, much higher. And it was in some ways more similar to World War II in that it was a war in which populations were targeted.
So now that we've established the basics about 1915, the contemporary records, U.S. diplomats, foreign missionaries, U.S. newspapers, all recording to one degree or another what was going on, how did we get to a point where a dispute over this could affect relations between the U.S. and Turkey for other than the obvious reason, and that is countries aren't apt to admit when they've done these types of things?
Sure. So I think in a sense, it's the power of the language of genocide. It's the power of the word genocide and its meaning in international law that has made this so acute. So if we back up a little bit, there's not really a literature of an Armenian genocide until the mid to late 70s. Now, Lemkin, when he came up with the word genocide,
Raphael Lemkin,
when he came up with the word genocide, he was thinking explicitly about the Armenian case as an example of genocide. But if you sort of look back into the scholarship in the 1950s and 1960s, people aren't talking about an Armenian genocide. So what happens? Effectively, starting in the 1970s, maybe a little bit in the late 60s, but mostly in the 1970s, you start to have a real literature of Holocaust studies. As that happens, as young Armenian American, primarily Armenian American scholars are looking at this scholarship and seeing the experience of their own parents, of their own families in this, right, seeing echoes of it, they start to develop the language of an Armenian genocide. And so by the early 80s, you start to have a real push for recognition of an Armenian genocide, and this becomes sort of internationalized. So the response of Turkey to that, starting in the 1980s, is utter rejection. And why do they reject it? They reject it, first of all, because they're afraid that it might have legal repercussions, either territorial or financial, because there was a lot of Armenian property that was expropriated by the Ottoman and then the Turkish state, but also because it took Turkey's moment of creation, the moment at which the Republic of Turkey was born, and it sullied it with the ultimate crime of our age, right? And so it was seen as both legally dangerous, but also as questioning the legitimacy of Turkish nationalism itself.
I mean, it's a stain on any nation to have committed genocide. So
sure,
that makes sense.
But I mean, California has officially recognized the genocide of Native Americans in California, and people are proudly Californian. I mean, genocide's not an uncommon experience.
Unfortunately.
I mean, there are plenty of U.S. citizens who are very comfortable with the idea of a genocide against Native Americans. There are plenty of patriotic U.S. citizens who recognize the role of slavery in the creation of the United States. I don't think that it's necessarily true that national sins need to be a rejection of national identity.
Or all encompassing. I mean, obviously, in Germany today is seen as a model for how a nation should face up to, although it took time for that to happen.
And it was done at gunpoint.
Yes, that is right. What does Turkey say happened to the estimated 1.5 million Armenians who were killed?
And I'll just be a pedantic historian and say the number 1.5, which is used, is probably high-end estimate of the number who were actually killed. It might have been 800,000. It might have been 1 million. We don't actually know how many Armenians were there to begin with, which makes it even more difficult. And we don't know how many were actually killed because we have these issues of adoption and abduction.
John Keegan, in his First World War book, pegged it at 700,000 men, women, and children from June 1915 to late 17.
That feels a little low to me, but I guess what I would say is that I'm very comfortable calling this a genocide, but I think that there's a lot of gray still there. And my one criticism of the Biden statement was that 1.5 million number, because I prefer to leave the gray when we're not 100% sure.
Yeah, what does Turkey say happened then?
So Turkey's basically said, yeah, there were massacres, that it was not a program of the state, that yes, there were massacres during transport, but that was sort of bandits and indiscipline in a collapsing empire. They will remind us of the number of Muslims who were also killed. They will talk about the role of Armenians, revolutionaries. So they'll effectively argue, first of all, there wasn't an intent to destroy. And secondly, this was a tragedy amongst tragedies. And it's unfair, first of all, to call it a genocide, and it's unfair to commemorate it outside of the larger tragedy of these other populations.
As a historian, do you buy that argument?
It's unquestionably true that huge numbers of innocents across confessions were killed during World War I. Many, many Muslims lost their lives unjustly. That doesn't change the reality that it was the Ottoman state engaged in a direct attack on its own people in this particular case. The one doesn't preclude the other.
Many people might be wondering, why does this matter all of a sudden? Because other countries have recognized the Armenian genocide. In Europe, it's really no secret. It's not something that was just discovered yesterday. But President Biden decides to do it now.
I think when Western countries have recognized the genocide, Turkey has always responded with loud rejection and fulminated. It's fair to note that they're much quieter about it when Russia, for example, does so, and Russia has repeatedly recognized the Armenian genocide. The United States is, of course, still the most important single country in the world, and for the United States to do so has weight. I think in the end, firstly, the weight of this is actually not that great internationally. I think the importance is primarily for Armenian Americans and having their own political leadership recognize the tragedy that befell their forebears. In terms of international law, it doesn't mean really anything. And Turkey's fulminated, but in the end, Turkey also hasn't done very much in response. It sort of had a day of denunciation and then moved on to other things because there are bigger, more immediate fish to fry in Turkish-U.S. relations. And at least part of the reason why Biden was willing to do this where previous presidents were not is precisely because the U.S.-Turkish relationship is not what it once was, and he doesn't feel as bound by Turkish preferences as previous administrations have.
Great segue into the next segment here, although I do want to ask about how the genocide is discussed, if at all, in Turkey and what the implications are for Turkey internally. But let's move on to that very important issue, because I've wondered about how long will this announcement by the president ripple? Because Turkey has been a U.S. ally for a long time, a member of NATO from the start, but the Cold War has been over for 30 years. And what has been straining the relationship recently?
So I think there are a couple of key things. First of all, NATO in general is having a bit of an identity crisis post-Soviet Union, in the same way that there are sort of debates about the meaning of NATO within Western European capitals, in the same way that there are debates about the value of NATO within some segments of American politics. This is a component of that. In effect, what is the role of NATO in a post-Cold War era? And do the parties that signed on for an anti-Soviet alliance still see the same buy-in in a post-Soviet context? I think part as well is that the United States is simply, it's still the most important power in the world economically, politically, militarily, but it's a less important power than it was in, say, 1991. And finally, from the Turkish end, Turkey has long aspired for many, many decades. Turkey has long aspired for a more multivalent foreign policy, one that is less dependent on the West, for a greater role in world affairs. The Turkish public and Turkish leaders have long believed that Turkey had a natural role in the world that had not been realized. And I think there are ways in which the AKP government under President Erdogan are distinctive, but in many ways, what we're seeing is Turkey being more assertive because there's been a broad consensus in Turkey that Turkey should be more assertive. And that hasn't always worked out to being on the same page with the U.S.
When we say Turkey, what do we mean? The country was once held up as a model for a Muslim-majority country with a secular, democratic government, but it is sliding in the opposite direction.
It certainly is, though I also think that the good old days were probably less good than we remember them to be. It was never quite as secular as we believed it to be. It was certainly not as democratic as we tended to frame it. President Erdogan has been able to capitalize on institutional weaknesses within Turkish democracy to effectively bond state to party in new ways. I think that although there were always significant problems in Turkish electoral politics, the problems are more acute today than they were in recent memory. Turkey is certainly more authoritarian, but my overall argument, and where I think I tend to be a little bit different than the way we often talk about Turkey, is that Turkey authoritarianism today is a child of the authoritarian qualities of the Turkish state before. I don't think that the problem is a bad government came. Simply, I think the problem is that the system was ripe for corruption because it was corrupt from the beginning.
We've been discussing what has led to the strained relationship between these two longtime allies. It sounds like you're saying Turkey's leaders believe they don't need the United States as much as they once did, and maybe the United States sees Turkey as not being as necessary as it once was.
I think that's exactly it. We can go into the details of specific policy problems, but at the core, we're just not that into each other anymore.
Dating for a long time, but, time to move on.
And I think that that's, in a sense, okay. I think that the language of friendship between countries is a little bit inept because we don't really have friendships. We have relationships. We have interests. Sometimes those interests are shared. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they actually clash. And we manage those things. And we manage them with our close allies, and we manage those things with our enemies. And so I think that the relationship is sort of naturally separating. I think that can be managed better or worse, but I think that even in a good scenario, we're simply not going to have the sort of lockstep that we once had.
Well, one reason why U.S. presidents refused to recognize the Armenian Genocide because they didn't want to damage the relationship. Turkey bought arms from the United States, and there was a recent arms deal between Russia and Turkey that caused consternation. During the Trump administration, President Trump was criticized for giving Erdogan pretty much a blank check to launch a military incursion into, I think it was Syria. So there's all these complications. I don't know if you want to untangle some of those for us.
So Trump and Erdogan at a personal level got along very well because they were both transactionalists. The problem was that Erdogan's a much better transactionalist than Trump was. And so while they engaged in this sort of tete-a-tete bargain making, Erdogan profited much more fully than the United States did. The S-400s, the purchase of Russian arms, is really the interesting one. And one place where I can't explain it easily in terms of interests. It's not clear to me why Turkey made this multi-billion-dollar deal. It doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. It was very clear what the U.S. position was. And while Trump may have muddled the message, it's hard to tell. The State Department and Congress were very clear what the repercussions of buying a Russian missile system would be. One argument is that Erdogan wanted it as a sort of coup proofing against another attempted coup. There was an attempted coup in 2016 that Erdogan appears to blame in part on the United States.
That's right. We haven't brought that up yet. He blames it on a cleric who lives in Pennsylvania.
He blames it on a cleric who lives in Pennsylvania, but behind that, he also believes that the fact that the United States has given safe harbor to Fethullah Gulen, the cleric in question, his sort of historical memory that the United States supports coups around the world. Sometimes the United States has and sometimes it hasn't, but that's the way Erdogan perceives it. It seems, I guess, the most likely explanation for wanting the Russian surface-to-air missiles was that they would provide some outside of NATO protection against a potential airstrike on, for example, the presidential palace, which, happened during the attempted coup. Be that as it may, that points to the extent to which Turkey it's not trying to leave NATO, it's not trying to divorce from the United States, but it doesn't want to rely on NATO or the US. It wants to have a multi-directional foreign policy and security policy.
Well, it sounds like you're saying Turkey is pursuing its own foreign policy, not necessarily the one the United States wants for it. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to the genocide. Is it freely discussed in Turkey? What's the popular mood?
I saw a recent poll that said 90% of the Turkish population believes that it was not genocide. That sounds about right to me. I think that there are left of center intellectuals who recognize the scholarship. There's certainly plenty of historians who are aware of the scholarship and, in fact, write and contribute to the scholarship in very important ways. And I think that there are Kurds who see echoes of the Armenian genocide in their own experience, and so there's buy-in there. But it's a very small percentage of the population. There are scholars who work on the Armenian genocide. They largely almost exclusively write in English or French. You can find some good publications. There are important works that are published in Turkish on the Armenian genocide. But, how many people read serious history books anywhere?
Yeah.
The government has a drumbeat about the falsity of this narrative. It's based largely on a handful of Western scholars who, for one reason or another, don't believe that it constituted genocide, and some very stodgy scholarship that's not well regarded.
That's what the Turkish government points to in their own defense.
Sure.
These other scholars.
And when you see discussions of the Armenian genocide on TV, it's 4 different versions of why it didn't happen. Now, I want to give the AKP credit for actually opening up these discussions somewhat. There are now, since the AKP came to power, there are commemorations of the Armenian genocide in certain locales. There are publications on the Armenian genocide. There are still people who on occasion will be prosecuted for talking about the Armenian genocide, but that's, I think, less the case than it was a couple of decades ago. So it's not that it's utterly impossible to talk about. It's that in a controlled media environment and in a society where there's, I think, a predilection to not see this history as one in which Turks were perpetrators of crimes, it's simply those discussions are pretty marginal.
It's interesting that there's not a complete blackout on it. For instance, in China, you can't talk about the Tiananmen Square. They censor their internet.
And Turkey isn't China. There are still civil society organizations. There's still scholars doing free research. It is an authoritarian environment. It's an environment where people can be prosecuted fairly arbitrarily, but it's also a diverse society with lots of civil society organizations, with scholars who engage in global discussions. It's a hybrid society.
So let's wrap up by going back to President Biden's decision to recognize the Armenian Genocide. Given all we've discussed, how important will that be in U.S.-Turkey relations, if we're going to try to predict the future for a moment? Which we shouldn't, but we're going to try.
For Armenian Americans, I think it's really important. I'm gratified Biden spoke on this only because of the official program of denialism that Turkey perpetrates. Otherwise, I'm not particularly interested in state leaders making pronouncements on historical events. It's not that interesting to me. Politically, I don't think it makes much difference. I think that in the end, it's another minor irritant on a whole pile of irritants Turkey and the U.S. have between them right now. And I don't think it's going to change the basic dynamics of the relationship at all.
But getting the history right is important.
Yeah, there's value in calling a spade a spade.
Howard Eissenstat, thank you for providing context to help us understand President Biden's historic announcement. On the next episode of History as It Happens, going deeper on immigration.
For more than 30 years, politicians have talked about immigration reform, and we've done nothing about it. It's time to fix it.
What if we're getting the border crisis all wrong? What if immigration isn't a problem to be stopped? We'll consider those questions next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.